On the night Ilara Monroe turned 18, everything changed, though the change didn't come with fireworks or celebration, but with silence, heavy and electric, the kind of silence that comes after doing something you can never undo. She woke up in his bed, surrounded by a world that didn't belong to her, silk sheets, the faint scent of cedar and leather, sunlight pouring through tall windows as if trying to expose her. Her body was sore in ways she didn't know it could be, and her heart beat with a strange mixture of shame, confusion, and something dangerously close to satisfaction. Jonathan Cain was gone, of course, just like she knew he would be. He had always been a master of exits, the kind that left questions behind, and now his absence filled the mansion more loudly than his presence ever had. She pulled on his shirt, the one he'd been wearing last night, the fabric still warm and too large, and walked barefoot across the cold marble floor, her thoughts racing. He was her legal guardian, had been for 5 years, ever since the fire that took her parents, a fire she still didn't understand, a fire that burned through her life and left only ashes, until Jonathan Cain, billionaire, tech mogul, and a man too powerful for someone like her to comprehend, stepped in and claimed responsibility for a girl he should have ignored. She had lived in his home, under his rules, with silent dinners and locked rooms, tutors instead of friends, private security instead of freedom. And still, somewhere in the quiet of all that isolation, she had fallen in love with him. She didn't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the first time she saw him come home after midnight, exhausted, loosening his tie, walking past her without a word but pausing long enough to check she had locked her door. Maybe it was the night he found her crying on the kitchen floor, sobbing over a forgotten birthday, and he sat beside her, neither of them speaking, his hand barely brushing hers, and somehow that was more comfort than any embrace. Or maybe it was simply the way he looked at her art, really looked, like he saw pieces of her soul she hadn't dared reveal. Last night, that look had changed. There had been no pretending, no wall between them, no silence. She had gone to him, not out of impulse but certainty, and he hadn't stopped her, hadn't reminded her that he was 38, that she was still too young, too vulnerable, too tied to him in ways the law might question and society would condemn. He let it happen. He let her happen. But in the morning he was gone, leaving behind only silence and a note on the hallway table. "You are free now. Live your life. Forget me." She read the words over and over, her fingers trembling, her throat tight. There was no apology, no explanation, just distance and dismissal, as if what happened between them was a mistake to erase. But it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like the only honest thing they'd ever shared. And now, he wanted her to forget. She stood in the foyer, still wearing his shirt, her bare feet rooted to the floor, the early sun slicing through the windows like judgment. Then, slowly, she turned back toward the grand staircase, climbed each step with purpose, her heart pounding louder with every movement. In her bedroom, she found her sketchbook, flipped to a blank page, and began to draw. Not his eyes this time, but his hand, the way it hovered beside her cheek before pulling away, a memory unfinished. She paused, pencil trembling, then turned the page, picked up her phone, and made a call. She wasn't going to forget. She wasn't going to run. This time, she would fight. Ilara Monroe had grown up faster than most girls her age, not by choice but by necessity, by tragedy, and by the quiet demands of a life wrapped in silk and secrets. At 13, she was pulled from the ashes of her family's estate in Santa Barbara, the fire labeled an accident, the case closed before questions could be asked. That night took more than her parents. It stole her home, her future, her innocence, and left her in the care of a state that never planned for girls like her, soft-spoken and bruised on the inside, where no one could see. She spent 2 months in a government-run shelter where no one looked her in the eye, and every noise at night made her flinch, until Jonathan Cain walked in like a man stepping from a movie scene. Black coat, silver cufflinks, signature unreadable, and told the social worker he would take full guardianship. People whispered, of course, because Jonathan Cain didn't do anything without reason. A self-made billionaire in the tech world, known for his ruthlessness in boardrooms and silence in interviews, he was a ghost in society, appearing only at charity galas and funerals, always alone, always composed. He never married, never had children, and had no known connection to the Monroe family. Yet the court approved the guardianship without protest. His lawyers moved fast, and just like that, Elara was living in a mansion perched on the cliffs of Carmel by the sea, a place so beautiful it made her feel like a visitor in her own life. The house was a fortress made of glass and stone, modern but cold, with wide-open spaces and rooms that echoed when she spoke too loudly. Her bedroom overlooked the Pacific. Her art studio faced the rose garden, and every hallway was lined with security cameras and staff that bowed their heads when passing her. She had everything she needed: private tutors, a grand piano she didn't know how to play, dresses she didn't choose, food she never requested, but she lacked one thing: freedom. Jonathan was rarely home, always working, always traveling, always somewhere else. But when he was home, his presence was sharp, controlled, like a shadow that carried weight. He spoke in measured words, looked through her rather than at her, and kept their interactions formal. At dinner, he would ask about her studies, her art, her health, but never her dreams, never her grief, never the fire. Still, Elara watched him, studied the way he poured his scotch but never finished it, the way his hands trembled slightly when reading old letters in his office late at night, the way he never smiled but sometimes lingered in the doorway of her art room like he wanted to say something and couldn't. She grew up in that silence, shaped by his distance, and learned to fill the spaces between them with sketches, paintings, stories she told herself in her mind. Over the years, he became more than her guardian. He became her obsession, the man she painted again and again, always in profile, never facing her, like she was afraid that if she drew him looking at her, she'd have to face what that meant. She tried to convince herself it was admiration, gratitude, but deep down she knew it wasn't. It was longing, slow-burning and dangerous, the kind that kept her up at night, wondering what would happen if she ever crossed the line. Jonathan never gave her reason to believe he saw her as more than a responsibility. He provided everything but affection, protected her without warmth, and maintained boundaries like fences around a garden she wasn't allowed to touch. And yet, sometimes, she caught glimpses of something different, like the way he tensed when other men looked at her too long, or how his voice softened when saying her name in the rare moments they were alone. There was a moment when she turned 17 when he canceled a trip to Tokyo to stay home for her birthday, claiming a scheduling conflict, but spent the entire evening in his study drinking alone. She watched from the hallway, unseen, as he opened an old photo album and stared at a picture she never knew existed. Her, at 6, holding her mother's hand. She began to question everything. Who was he really? Why her? Why did a man like that, with no interest in family, claim her from a shelter and never let her go? Why did he keep her so close, yet so far, feeding her life but starving her of connection? Her friends at art school never understood her distance, her caution, her reluctance to let anyone in. They thought she was mysterious, elegant, guarded by choice. But the truth was simpler. She had spent 5 years loving a man who built walls around both of them. And now, at 18, after a night that changed everything, those walls were cracking, and the light coming through was blinding. For weeks after that night, Elara felt like a ghost in her own body, walking through the marble halls of the Kane estate like she no longer belonged, haunted by the memory of his hands, his breath, the sound of her name on his lips, spoken not with control or distance, but with something close to desperation. Everything in the house remained the same. The staff still nodded silently when she passed. The waves still crashed rhythmically against the cliffs below. Her room still smelled faintly of paint and sea salt, but nothing inside her was the same. Because once a line has been crossed, It never truly disappears. It simply waits, like a crack in the foundation, quiet but irreversible. Jonathan avoided her more than before, and that was saying something. Where once he might pass by her art room and pause, now he walked a different hallway. Where once he might linger after dinner for a brief, uncomfortable exchange, now he ate alone in his study and had his meals delivered. And where once he said her name, now he didn't speak at all. She tried to convince herself it didn't matter, that she had imagined more than what it was, that the heat between them was an illusion conjured by a lonely girl and a man who couldn't say no. But then she would close her eyes at night and feel his breath against her skin, remember the way he whispered, "Don't stop," like a man drowning, and no amount of denial could undo the truth she now carried. She was in love with him, not the fairy tale kind, but the heavy kind, the kind rooted in years of watching him suffer in silence, the kind that grew in the dark corners of grief and bloomed under the weight of secrets. It wasn't just about what happened that night, it was everything that led to it. Every glance that lingered too long, every conversation that stopped short of something real, every choice he made to keep her close, and every moment he pushed her away. But the silence couldn't last forever. One afternoon, while walking past his office, she saw the doors slightly open, heard his voice, low and strained, not in conversation with anyone but with himself. She paused, the edge of her shadow falling across the floor, and listened as he spoke words she was never meant to hear. He spoke of guilt, of fire, of promises he couldn't keep. He spoke her name like a confession, like a prayer. Like something holy and forbidden, she stepped away before he could see her, heart pounding, realizing that the distance between them was not made of absence, but fear. That night, she waited for him in the garden. It was the place where they shared one of their first moments of connection, when she was 14 and had painted a tree that no longer existed. He told her then that sometimes memories were more powerful than truth, and she had carried those words ever since. When he saw her waiting, he hesitated, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. She stood slowly and faced him, feeling more like a woman than she ever had, not because of what happened between them, but because she no longer felt the need to ask for permission to feel what she felt. He told her to go inside, that the night air was cold, that she shouldn't be outside alone. She told him she wasn't cold, and she wasn't alone, not when he was standing 3 feet away pretending he didn't care. She asked him why he left her that morning, why he walked away like it meant nothing, and his answer was a silence so loud it nearly broke her. But then he stepped forward, just slightly, and said something she never expected. "But if I stayed, I would have kept you." He didn't touch her, not that night, not again, but his voice cracked on the word kept, and it stayed with her longer than any kiss. The days that followed were a dance of almosts. He stopped avoiding her, but he didn't seek her out. They began to talk again, in fragments, over books left open on the kitchen counter, over passing questions about her paintings, over the gentle rhythm of coexisting. She sensed something shifting in him, something fighting to surface, but it was buried under layers of control so old they had become instinct. Then, one evening, while cleaning out an old storage room in the East Wing, she found a locked drawer in an antique desk. The key was taped beneath the drawer, hidden but not well. She hesitated, then opened it, and inside found a collection of newspaper clippings, all related to the fire that killed her parents. Every article, every photo, every theory, neatly folded, preserved, and annotated in the margins. What stood out wasn't the information she had long accepted the fire as a cruel twist of fate, but the obsessive way Jonathan had kept everything. The underlined sentences, the circled names, the way her father's name appeared next to the word betrayal. Her hands shook as she unfolded a letter, unsigned, written in a familiar hand, warning that her father had made dangerous enemies, that the fire wasn't random, that someone powerful wanted him silenced. She confronted Jonathan that night, stormed into his office, the letter in her hand, fury in her voice. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to lie. He simply looked at her with that same expression he wore every time she got too close, like he was trying to remember how to breathe. He admitted he had known for years that he suspected his father had something to do with it, that the Monroe estate had been part of a silent takeover plan that went wrong. He had taken her in not just out of guilt, but to protect her, because he feared what would happen if she stayed in the system, unguarded, vulnerable. But she didn't want protection, not anymore. She wanted truth. She wanted agency. She wanted to stop being a symbol of a broken past and start being a person with a future. She told him that whatever had passed between them, whatever feelings remained, couldn't survive in the shadows. And he agreed, not with words, but with the way he finally let his guard drop, the way he looked at her not like a man guarding a secret, but like one surrendering to it. They began to rebuild, not quickly, not easily, but with honesty. He gave her space, and she filled it with herself, with her art, with her choices. He stopped watching her from a distance and started listening. They spent more time together, not hidden, not ashamed, but cautious and intentional. It was no longer about passion or longing. It was about healing. Yet, in the quiet that followed, something darker stirred in the corners of her mind. Because once you learn the truth about one thing, you begin to question everything. And Alara was starting to wonder just how deep Jonathan's secrets went. Alara had always believed the worst was behind her, that the fire which took her parents had burned through the darkest part of her life, but now, with each passing day, she began to see how much of her world had been built on half-truths and carefully arranged lies. Jonathan no longer denied her access to the house's restricted spaces, and he no longer avoided her questions. But there was something in his eyes that warned her he was still holding something back. He tried to move forward, tried to rebuild the quiet trust they had begun to nurture, but trust built on unfinished stories eventually crumbles, and deep down, she knew there was more, something deeper, something he hadn't yet told her. The letter she had found haunted her not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. The warning was written weeks before the fire, typed but with handwritten notes in the margins, and one of the names underlined repeatedly was Charles Kane, Jonathan's father. Alara didn't know much about the elder Kane except that he had been one of the most feared and respected financiers on the West Coast, a man who had built empires and ruined families with the same shrug of a pen. He had died 3 years ago, just before her 16th birthday, and Jonathan never spoke of him, never kept any photos, never attended public memorials. She thought it was simply grief or distance, but now she wondered if it was guilt. One morning, while Jonathan was away in Los Angeles on business, Alara took the opportunity to explore the one room she had never entered, the vault-like library on the 3rd floor, always locked, its key kept on Jonathan's private key ring. She had seen him unlock it only once, years ago, and that memory had faded until now. When she found the ring on his desk, she hesitated only a moment before slipping it into her pocket. The door opened with a heavy metallic click, and she stepped inside, half expecting alarms or cameras, but found only silence, thick with the scent of old paper and leather. The library was unlike the rest of the house. It wasn't cold or modern, but dark and traditional, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, most filled with legal documents, ledgers, and old contracts. In the corner sat a filing cabinet marked with a brass plate, Monroe, her name carved into metal, sitting in the middle of her guardian's fortress, like a ghost waiting to be found. Inside the drawers, she discovered a full investigation report commissioned by Jonathan himself. It detailed the timeline of her father's last business dealings, highlighting a merger that had been blocked, followed by a sudden insurance policy change, and finally, an anonymous tip sent to Charles Kane about insider trading allegations. Her father had tried to stop a hostile takeover by exposing the Kane's manipulation, and in doing so, had signed his own death warrant. The report didn't say it outright, but between the lines, the implication was clear. Her parents had been murdered to protect a financial empire, and Jonathan knew it. He didn't plan the fire. He wasn't the one who gave the order. But he protected the man who did, buried the truth, took her in and kept her close, not just out of guilt, but maybe out of strategy. If she was under his roof, she couldn't ask questions, couldn't dig too deep, couldn't find her way to the truth. And yet, she had. When he returned home that evening, she was waiting for him in the library, the file on her lap, her face pale but calm. She didn't scream or cry. She simply asked, "Why?" Jonathan stood at the threshold, eyes shadowed, the tired weight of his secrets visible in every line of his face. He sat across from her and didn't pretend to misunderstand. He told her the truth, slowly and without embellishment. He was 23 when he first learned of his father's empire, of the dark deals and backroom threats, of the quiet way people disappeared when they became inconvenient. He had tried to distance himself, created his own company, moved away, but blood is heavier than paper, and his name was still Kane. When her father tried to expose the firm's illegal behavior, Charles ordered his silence, and when the fire happened, Jonathan wasn't in the country, but he was the first to receive the news. He could have walked away, could have let her be absorbed by the system, but when he saw her, broken and alone in that shelter, he couldn't. He had spent his life trying to become a different man from his father, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw a chance to protect something pure, even if the foundation was poison. He never meant to fall in love with her. That part, he said, came slowly, painfully, against every line he swore never to cross. But it happened, and when she turned 18, when she came to him with certainty and fire in her eyes, he broke. He never wanted her to know the truth because he believed it would destroy everything she thought she was. But what he failed to realize was that she had already been destroyed. She had already lost her family, her identity, her freedom. What she wanted now wasn't to be protected, but to be told the truth, no matter how sharp it cut. They sat in silence for a long time, the air between them thick with everything that could not be undone. He asked if she hated him, and she said she didn't know. He said he would leave if she asked, give her everything, the house, the company, his name, and she said she didn't want any of it. What she wanted was control over her own story. In the days that followed, Elora withdrew from the house. She stopped painting, she stopped eating. She moved into the guest wing and spent her nights walking along the cliffs, watching the ocean and listening to the wind. Jonathan respected her distance, never tried to force conversation, never asked for forgiveness. He simply waited. And one night, when she returned from a long walk, she found a package on her bed. Inside was a notebook, leather-bound and blank, and a note. "You write the story now. I'm done hiding it." Elora stared at the notebook, her fingers tracing the cover, and something in her chest shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to understanding. She had always been told who she was, where to live, what to feel. For the first time, she realized she didn't have to accept any of it. The truth had broken her illusions. Now it could build her freedom. The days after the truth settled into Elora like quiet thunder, not loud, not immediate, but constant, and always just beneath the surface. She thought knowing everything would bring clarity, that the secrets Jonathan carried would collapse under their own weight and allow her to move forward, but instead, they lingered in the corners of every room, following her footsteps, watching her like ghosts too stubborn to fade. She no longer looked at Jonathan with the eyes of a girl seeking affection or guidance, because that girl had burned away with her innocence, replaced by someone sharper, someone who had learned that love, no matter how tender, can be born from guilt, and that truth, even when confessed, does not erase the damage done by silence. He didn't try to win her back, didn't ask for anything, and for that she was both grateful and bitter. He simply existed nearby, a shadow she couldn't avoid, a man who had given her safety but also withheld the very truths that defined her life. Sometimes she caught him watching her from the second-floor balcony as she walked the cliffs alone. Not intrusively, not possessively, just present, And sometimes that was worse than absence, because presence reminded her of everything she used to crave. She tried to return to painting, but found herself staring at blank canvases for hours, her hands heavy, her heart unsure what story to tell. Every image she imagined now came layered with fire, betrayal, and the soft memory of Jonathan's voice whispering her name, as though it was both a curse and a prayer. Her body remembered his touch, but her mind carried the weight of the history that brought them there, and no matter how much she wanted to separate the man from the legacy, the blood that ran through his veins was the same that had erased her family. Then came the letter, sealed with a wax insignia she didn't recognize, delivered not by mail but slipped under her bedroom door one morning. Inside were court summons, a legal request to appear before the State Financial Fraud Commission, and a subpoena demanding her presence at a private hearing. The case? Monroe Holdings, her father's company, which had been quietly reopened due to anonymous leads and new evidence of arson linked to corporate sabotage. Ilara froze, the pages trembling in her hands, because she hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't shared the documents she'd found, and the only person who could have leaked that information was Jonathan. She confronted him the same day, cornering him in the kitchen, where he stood pouring coffee, dressed in worn clothes and looking more tired than she had ever seen him. He didn't deny it, didn't even flinch, just said he had sent everything to the authorities weeks ago before she ever found the library files. He had waited for the right time to tell her, but realized the right time might never come. He told her he was ready to testify, that he had given up his shares, resigned from the board, and was prepared to destroy his family's empire if it meant justice. She asked him why now, why after all these years, and his answer came slowly but without hesitation, because the only reason he hadn't done it sooner was fear. Fear of what it would do to her, fear of what it would reveal about himself, fear of becoming the man his father always accused him of being. But now, he said, fear didn't matter, because she mattered more. The hearing was held in San Francisco, behind closed doors, guarded by lawyers, cameras, and layers of protocol. Ilara sat alone in a cold hallway waiting for her turn to speak, her palms sweating, her mind racing through every possible outcome. She wasn't a trained witness, wasn't a legal expert, but she knew what she had seen, what she had read, and when her name was called, she stood up and walked into that room like a girl finally stepping into her own life. Inside, she saw faces she recognized from old photographs, men who had smiled beside her father in business meetings, executives who had toasted to partnerships now revealed to be built on blackmail and lies. And across the room sat Jonathan, not in a position of power, not behind a desk or podium, but beside her, no longer her guardian, no longer the man who controlled her world, but simply a man trying to do the right thing, too late. She spoke calmly, clearly, detailing the documents she found, the patterns she noticed, the confessions Jonathan had made, and when asked about her relationship to him, she didn't flinch, didn't lie, didn't dress it up. She told them the truth, that she had loved him, still loved him, but that love doesn't protect anyone from consequence, and if justice meant exposing everything, then she was willing to do that. The fallout came fast. Headlines across California screamed betrayal, empire collapse, daughter of dead CEO breaks silence. Jonathan Kane became both villain and hero, depending on who was asked. He faced charges not for the fire, but for obstruction, for hiding evidence, for covering up financial crimes, and though he wouldn't see prison, the settlement nearly erased his fortune. The Kane name was no longer feared, but dissected, analyzed, and ridiculed by the very investors who once worshipped it. For weeks, Ilara avoided the media, turning off her phone, retreating to the far edge of the estate where the cliffs met the sea. She thought she would feel triumphant, thought justice would taste like freedom, but instead it tasted like ashes, because winning meant admitting what she had lost could never be returned. Jonathan didn't speak to her during those weeks, giving her the space she once begged for, and maybe it was that silence that made her realize how much of her anger had turned inward. One evening, she found herself standing outside his room, unsure whether to knock or leave. She opened the door anyway. He was sitting on the floor, back against the bed, shirt sleeves rolled, papers scattered around him like fallen leaves. He looked up, startled, but said nothing. She stepped inside, sat beside him without a word, and for a long time they just breathed. Finally, she asked him if he regretted loving her. He looked at her, eyes tired but honest, and said no, never. He only regretted not trusting her sooner. She told him she wasn't sure what they were now, what could ever grow from a love that had survived so many fractures. He said maybe they weren't supposed to define it yet, maybe the name didn't matter, only the truth. That night they didn't touch, they didn't kiss. They just sat there, side by side, two people trying to piece themselves together without pretending they hadn't shattered. And for the first time in a long time, Ilara slept without dreams. The weeks turned into months, and the air between Ilara and Jonathan settled into something quieter. Not peace, exactly, but a mutual understanding that neither of them was who they were before the truth unraveled. The estate no longer felt like a cage to her, but it didn't feel like home either. Not yet. The media frenzy began to fade, replaced by newer scandals and fresher gossip, and the name Kane stopped appearing on the front page, but the weight it carried inside their lives hadn't lightened. Jonathan sold the company entirely, transferring the funds into foundations that supported victims of corporate crime, an act that drew both praise and suspicion, because when a man like him suddenly turned righteous, the world always looks for a price. Ilara kept her distance from the spotlight, refusing interviews, declining offers to write memoirs or appear on television. She spent her time repainting the walls of the old garden room, converting it into a personal studio, a space filled with natural light and large canvases that demanded nothing but her own voice. She began painting again, first in muted tones, then with bolder colors, strokes that spoke of fire and rebirth, of broken lines coming together in new shapes. But even as her art returned, a part of her remained uncertain, stuck in the space between love and fear, between forgiveness and doubt. She told herself she needed time, that healing wasn't linear, that the heart doesn't always listen to logic. Jonathan understood, or at least pretended to. Never pushing, never asking, always nearby but never too close, as if he knew any sudden movement might cause her to run. He had become quieter, more human, stripped of his power, no longer the man in the shadows of boardrooms and private jets, but someone who trimmed his own hedges and took walks without security. One afternoon, while organizing old canvases, Ilara found a sketch she had made years ago, one she barely remembered drawing. It was of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, arms outstretched, but his shadow didn't match his form. It stretched backward, monstrous, a figure holding a torch. She stared at it for a long time, realizing she had seen something long before she could name it. That her intuition had always been quietly aware of the danger lurking beneath the surface of the man who raised her. Yet now, looking at the sketch, she didn't feel fear. She felt sadness. That night, she asked him to dinner, not out of obligation or to rehash the past, but because something inside her needed to look him in the eye again, not as a victim or survivor, but as a woman choosing what to carry forward. They sat across from each other in the same dining room where so many of their early conversations had been clipped and formal, and now, with the table stripped of crystal and formality, they ate simple food in silence. A silence that felt almost comfortable. Afterward, he walked her to the studio, and she showed him the new piece she had started, a canvas nearly 6 feet tall, still unfinished, a woman with no face but arms that reached through fire toward light. He stared at it for a long time, then asked if she had painted herself. She said maybe, or maybe it was someone she hoped to become. He told her she was already halfway there. That was the first time in months she let him touch her hand. The contact was brief, tentative, but charged, and in that moment she realized something had shifted. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't broken either. What she was, finally, was uncertain, in a way that didn't terrify her. A week later, she received a letter from an attorney handling the estate of her late grandfather, someone she barely remembered. Inside was a deed to a small lakeside cabin in Montana, along with a note written years ago, never sent, addressed to her mother. In it, her grandfather spoke of regret, of the ways he had failed to protect his daughter from the world of powerful men, of secrets that festered in families and poisoned generations. He left the cabin to Elara as a sanctuary, a place untouched by business, by bloodlines, by tragedy. Something in that letter broke her wide open. She packed a bag, left Jonathan a brief note, and took the first flight out of California. She didn't tell him where she was going, didn't promise to return, because she didn't know if she would. The cabin was small and weather-worn, nestled among trees that whispered in the wind, a lake that reflected the sky like a mirror too honest to avoid. She spent her days chopping wood, painting by the water, watching the stars without city lights to dim their glow. For the first time in years, she felt entirely alone, and it didn't scare her, it freed her. Months passed. She grew stronger, not just physically, but mentally. She wrote long letters to her parents, letters she never mailed, burying them beneath a tree behind the cabin like offerings to the past. She stopped wearing makeup. She stopped waiting for a text or a call. And then one day, while painting by the shore, she looked up and saw Jonathan standing across the water. He didn't wave. He didn't call her name. He simply stood there, dressed in hiking boots and flannel, looking nothing like the man who once controlled boardrooms. She didn't move either. Minutes passed. Finally, she put down her brush, walked across the dock, and said, "You found me." He nodded and said, "I didn't come to take you back. I came to see if you were okay." She asked how he even knew where to look, and he said her silence pointed louder than her words. They didn't talk about the past, not at first. They sat by the fire, drank coffee, watched the wind bend the trees. Later that night, she asked him why he came all this way. He said because love doesn't always mean holding on, sometimes it means letting go. But he needed to see with his own eyes that she had truly let go of him. She looked at him, really looked, and saw no trace of the man who once kept her in a golden cage. Only someone who had finally accepted that love isn't something you earn with protection or power. It's something you are given when you're no longer afraid to be seen. She told him she didn't know what they were or if they could be anything again, and he said that was okay, that he didn't come for answers, only to give her a choice. He stayed 2 nights in the cabin next to hers, cooked simple meals, helped her fix a leaking pipe, asked about her paintings without touching any, and when he left, he didn't ask her to follow. He left her a book on the nightstand, a collection of poems by her favorite author, with a note tucked inside the first page. No promises, just hope. No timelines, just space. She cried for hours after he left, not out of sadness but relief, because for the first time, love didn't come wrapped in guilt or secrets. It came quietly, respectfully, patiently. She returned to California weeks later, not because he asked, but because she was ready. She walked into the estate like someone who belonged to herself, and when he saw her, he didn't run, didn't reach, just waited. She said, "I'm not here to fix anything. I'm just here to see what we can grow now." He smiled for the first time in a long time, and it wasn't the guarded smile of a man protecting his heart, but the soft one of someone finally laying it down. Elara didn't expect life to feel simple, not after everything that had unfolded, but what surprised her was how peaceful the complexity had become. She no longer saw her past as a chain dragging behind her, but as a long road she had walked with bloody feet and open eyes. And now, every step forward felt like a quiet rebellion against everything that tried to break her. She and Jonathan didn't label what they had, didn't promise forever or define boundaries they hadn't yet reached. Instead, they built something slow, something deliberate, days spent creating routines that were small but meaningful. He planted herbs in the back garden. She painted again with color she hadn't used in years. They read on opposite ends of the couch, shared music, cooked simple dinners, and learned the art of being present without performing. They didn't talk much about the fire anymore, or the courtroom, or the years of silence that kept them bound in confusion, not because those things no longer mattered, but because they no longer needed to hold them so tightly. Some wounds don't heal by reopening. They heal when you stop picking at them. And that's what they had finally done, released the urge to define everything and instead focused on what made sense now. Jonathan, once a man who measured life in contracts and control, had become someone who asked before touching her hand, who waited for her to speak first, who respected the quiet as much as the answers. One morning, as the fog rolled in from the coast and blanketed the cliffs in gray, Ilara stood in front of her largest canvas yet, a piece she had worked on for months without knowing where it was leading. Jonathan came into the room silently, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, and when he set them down and looked at the painting, he didn't ask what it meant. He simply said, "It feels like healing," and she nodded, because it did. In the painting, a woman stood in the center of a storm, her hair wild, her arms outstretched, not in surrender, but in defiance. Behind her was fire, ahead of her was light, and around her was chaos, but her eyes were calm. Her mouth curved slightly in something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't sadness either. It was the truest thing Alora had ever painted, because it didn't seek to explain, only to exist. Later that evening, as they sat on the back steps watching the sun sink into the sea, Jonathan asked her what came next, and she answered honestly, "I don't know, but I'm not afraid of it." He looked at her like that answer was everything he ever needed, and maybe it was. They didn't need vows or timelines. They didn't need to chase perfection. They just needed to show up every day, willing to keep trying. The scars would always remain, the story would always be complicated, but love doesn't have to be clean to be real. Sometimes the most powerful kind is the one that survives the fire and stays anyway. And for the first time in a long time, Ilara believed she was no longer someone surviving her story, she was someone writing it.